It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Al, I want to start with you because it is striking that the Supreme Court took such a proactive stance against state legislatures deciding on their own how they would pick federal office. The count was 6-3. It was pretty impressive to see who voted in the majority, but I bet it changes the landscape politically, doesn't it?
First of all, I think what it showed is that at least the majority of the court, as what one observer said, was conservative, but not MAGA. It's good. It's the right decision. I'm pretty, it's not good that we still have 3 justices that would basically say that state legislatures can decide who wins the presidency. I don't think that's a great thing. But look, this is a very important decision. It's good for democracy. It reinforces the essential checks and balances that make our democratic system work. But it doesn't mean that in the future candidates and parties are going to quit litigating on to gain electoral or redistricting advantage. I think the answer is a big fat no. Just to be clear, all of our viewers may not understand this theory, and I'm not sure I really understand it. But this independent state legislature theory was concocted by John Eastman in a memo as part of President Trump's abortive effort to steal the 2020 election. Essentially, the theory maintains that the Constitution gives state legislatures the power, really without any constraint from their own state constitutions or judicial review, to set election procedures. The Trump scheme was to have, in states that Biden won, that had overwhelmingly Republican legislatures, was to get those legislatures to elect or appoint alternative alternative slates of electors to go to the Electoral College and vote for Trump, therefore ignoring the popular vote in the state. In this particular case, I think it was the North Carolina challenge on redistricting, where the legislature took an even electorate and had something like a 12-4 Republican advantage in congressional districts. It was challenged in state courts throughout the plan, and the legislature tried to get rid of the state court review, and the Supreme Court said, no, we can't do it. Lord knows I disagree with a lot of the things the Supreme Court has done, but there was also an earlier decision on voting rights in Alabama, and I think one that came out of this last decision on voting rights in Louisiana, that made it clear that the court is interested in preserving democracy. And the critical nature of that it cannot be understated, because it was the courts essentially that prevented Trump from a coup in 2020. But look, I suspect there are always going to be people who want to subvert the electoral process for their own candidates, who will want to do that for their own advantage. There'll be more Trumps. And if Trump is the nominee in 2024 and gets beat, my guess is he will go right back to theories like this, and we'll have to go through this whole again. And I guarantee you, state legislatures are not going to quit trying to gerrymander their states when they have the opportunity. In the end, I think the voters are going to have to take things like this into their own hands, and we hope they will. I mean, I hope it's not, as Liz Cheney said this week, that the problem with our system is we elect idiots. Take the state of Wisconsin. It's about as even as you could get politically, and yet in the state legislatures, because the Republicans had controlled it and had a Republican governor at the right time, they were able to gerrymander the states. I've said before that in the 20th century, we had 25 vote elections for president, and every time the Electoral College elected the candidate who won the popular vote. In the first 5 elections in this century, twice a candidate who won the popular vote lost the presidency. And even in 2020, Biden won by over 4% of the electorate in the popular vote, but he came within 44,000 votes of losing the presidency in the Electoral College. I'm not here today to tell you how we're going to fix that. It makes our system of popular vote majority rule very vulnerable.
Craig, a lot of people look at these decisions and they see basically the Republican Party taking a hit on this. But as we were talking before we started, Maryland is a good example of how Democrats have tried to manipulate the system.
Very true. I think if just to start maybe from a philosophical base, if you want to call it that, I really, over the last few decades, I admire people who run for office of both parties, and I've admired people who get elected. There's some I don't admire quite so much, but even among those I admire of either party, once in office, they come to a conclusion, and I understand it, that the only way for them to do the good things they wish to do is for them to stay elected. Once you come to that conclusion, then you're susceptible to the idea that anything that makes it easier to stay in office reduces the threat of a challenge to you, either in the primary or general election, is something you ought to look at. And it's just sort of the human nature of those people who get into office. I know I've said before here, I know Al agrees, elected officials, first and foremost, spend part of their time every day thinking about, what am I doing that's going to help me hold on to this office? And even like Andy Harris, our congressman from Maryland, who was for term limits until he got elected, usually the idea of a term limit goes away after a couple of terms. So I think the decision, as Al points out, I think the decision by the Supreme Court is a very important one. I think it's one in some ways they didn't have to make. I think some of the conservatives on the court said, look, the North Carolina court reversed itself, and why do we have to do this? So the fact that the Chief Justice and Kavanaugh and the liberals on the court came together, I think said, no, it's too important for us to just let this pass. I think voters probably go to the polls thinking, oh, the playing field's pretty level. I'm going to cast my vote for the best candidate, and that they do. In reality, this gerrymandering that's occurred throughout my entire lifetime. I remember being a political science student at UCLA, looking at the gerrymandering that was going on by Democrats in California, and certainly later by Republicans. But that process is designed to protect the chances of one party or the other capturing a majority. If you look at a map, to your point, Dave, if you look at a map of Maryland, it's a very convoluted design that does one thing. It ensures of the 8 congressional districts, 7 of them will be held by Democratic candidates. And that was designed by Democrats. And what they were willing to do in a state that for 2 terms elected a Republican governor, what they were willing to do is design the congressional map that absolutely locked in one Republican district, the 1st district of Maryland, and they gave that up so that they would always be able to make sure a Democrat was in the other 7 seats. That kind of protection, I would say, for Maryland's 1st district is what makes those who wish to challenge the incumbent a very, very difficult task. So there's a price to be paid. I think, I know Al agrees. I have said, our friends have said, elections really matter. And in this case, electing people who come to office that are more willing to accept a level playing field would be a real advantage, because, like Al concluded, I wholeheartedly agree. You can level the playing field a little by this Supreme Court decision, but people who are in this business are going to look for ways to protect the incumbent seat, and protect the party in terms of getting a majority, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat.
Al, there was and still remains a lot of anxiety about the number of Trump appointees on the Supreme Court. People have said in response that over time, justices change. They actually move into either a middle ground or kind of a different position when they started. Is there any indication that this is now happening on the Supreme Court?
I don't know. I mean, to be honest with you, it's a little too early to tell. I mean, this particular decision was a good decision and the right decision for democracy. But the court threw out the last year or last 2 years, as these Trump challenges came up to it, has generally voted in favor of democracy. So maybe there's some change, but you can be a conservative and have views that are, I believe, out of touch with the country on cultural and social issues and still believe in democracy. So on that front, I think the court is okay. But there are other decisions that are going to be that are going to come out. I mean, the Trump litmus test was on Roe versus Wade, and Roe versus Wade was thrown out by this court. Ironically, for the Republicans, that was the dog who caught the car, because it just hasn't worked out to the advantage. I mean, repealing Roe versus Wade is much better for the Republicans as an issue than it is as a reality. And it's brought out in a lot of conservative states like Kansas, and Kentucky, and others, a different kind of voting coalition on issues like that. Have another one on affirmative action. Affirmative action is a tougher issue. It's probably more split than Roe versus Wade, but it's still going to be a very important decision that's going to have a lot of social consequences and will be very controversial. On voting rights, this, in a sense, the Alabama case was a reversal, because the court for the last couple of decades has been limiting the Voting Rights Act, and here it basically went back and said, no, we have to have a sense of stronger Voting Rights Act to ensure 2 districts, minority districts in Alabama. But your question is a very good one, and justices do change, and I hope that's the case. But I think it's probably too early to make a definitive decision on the Trump justices.
Craig, you have the last word.
Well, certainly time will help inform us as to whether there's a change. Of the justices I have known, I've been fortunate to know a few. I really think they do step up to each case and listen to the facts and listen to the arguments and make a decision. And the reality that some of the justices are more conservative, perhaps, than the majority of Americans on certain sensitive social issues, doesn't mean that they're going to always vote in a very conservative direction, or that they necessarily move as a bloc. And I think Chief Justice Roberts, throughout his time, has proven that he takes a close look, and sometimes conservatives are upset with him, and sometimes they're applauding him. I do not think these people are human. They're not immune from the knowledge that the court is viewed with lower approval ratings than historically they have had for decades. I think maybe that's one of the reasons this case that we're talking about from North Carolina was one they wanted to take, even though they could have passed on the issue. But I think we'll have to find out. One person that, well, he's not a justice. He could have been, and in some ways, some of us think he should have been. Michael Ludick is someone who's traveled an interesting path and really has stepped up quite publicly. Some may remember his testimony about the dangers of the way former President Trump conducts himself. This is a very conservative jurist with a long history of being a conservative. And yet, when he looks at what's happening in the country, he's been willing to step up and speak out publicly. And of course, he now can do it as a citizen on any topic he chooses. But he was instrumental in advising Pence on the powers of a vice president and the limitations it had during the course of an election. So I think it's interesting to note that some of the jurists who have traveled this conservative path are viewing the world in a way that says, our democracy is fragile, as Al says. It needs to be protected, and we are a country where the rule of law still counts, and that ought to kind of inform and control behavior. So I think we'll see. My guess is there's a bit of a moderation, about the court, but time will tell.
Greg Fuller, Al Fromm, thank you so much indeed. We will see you next week.